Okay. So I'd like to introduce Ruth Lang to everybody, who's here to talk about the book Building for Change, the Architecture of Creative Reuse. And I'm going to pass over to Ruth now, who's going to give us a brief introduction to the book, and talk us through it.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for having me. Okay, so this book was written in the context of the climate emergency, which has forced the architectural profession to reevaluate the resources that we have available and to find ways that we can break out of a cycle of ceaseless consumption and waste, not least because demolition and construction waste constitutes a third of the EU's total waste output. It's been calculated that 25% of global emissions are made by existing buildings and 40% come from construction industry globally. But adopting creative reuse in architecture really does challenge the dogmatic hierarchies that we're familiar with in practice. And it questions the role of the architect within the design team, as I'll be exploring through some of the case studies in this book. Although it's very different from the ways I've been taught in practice in architecture and in my education, I find the opportunity really exciting. Since instead of demonstrating our creative prowess through the creation of iconic new buildings, we can instead deploy our creative ingenuity to reuse that which surrounds us. Creative reuse asks us to reevaluate that which we might privilege in architectural design, be that the environmental value of carbon consumption, the civic value of retaining an existing structure that's important to the community, or the economic value of construction and waste. It also asks us to consider needs beyond those which are immediately our own and take our design's impact on future generations into account. Our planet's currently facing a scarcity crisis with dwindling material resources of raw materials and fossil fuels, which can be put to our disposal, whilst the planet's population grows ever further. So there's a gap between the supply and demand, which is growing rapidly as a result, forcing us to reconsider how we might use these resources if we are to ensure a sustainable future for forthcoming generations. These might seem distant and abstract concerns, but as the delegates of COP26 and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change tell us, they demand our action now if we're to avoid catastrophe in the future. So why this book? Well, because as an architect in practice and as an educator at the Royal College of Art and the London School of Architecture, I found there's a real disconnect between the aspiration that publication of schemes in architectural press sets for reuse and the communication of the processes by which this can be achieved. So admiring the images of the end product wasn't helping us figure out how to put them into practice ourselves. I wanted to look beyond the imagery and instead consider the various negotiations which took place in the scheme's development and the changes in the ways that we practice as architects and designers, which we're going to need to adopt if we're to meet the aim of net carbon zero by 2050 or 2030, as so many authorities are realizing we need to do now. So I approached Gestalten to discuss how we might bring a publication together, which might begin to catalyse more opportunities to put these kind of strategies into practice. And in doing so, I felt it was important to reflect not only upon UK projects and the context of the British construction industry, but to identify alternative examples from around the world, to compare differences in approach and to consider what we might learn from each of these. The idea is not just to replicate these projects in other contexts, but to use them as the basis for reflection and developing new tactics for approaching reuse. So through my research, I've come to appreciate how reuse doesn't have to be the driving force behind an entire scheme, which can often feel off-putting and overwhelming, but instead can be undertaken at different scales with different approaches tailored to the project's demands. So the book's broken down into sections which each explore these scales. And the material scale, where buildings might be broken down into components which can be repurposed in new applications. The building scale, where spatial interventions can adapt a building's programme to address shifting societal demands. At the site scale, thinking about how larger scale reorchestration of a building's context can help open up opportunities for reuse rather than demolition. And finally, exploring how buildings might be designed to be adapted and altered over time, building in this future use from the outset. So the first of these is the scale of the material, which may appear the most obvious approach for creative reuse. But actually, there are many considerations we need to take into account if we're to employ this strategy more effectively. So practices such as Rota and Rota DC are key proponents in employing reuse strategies, thanks to their role spanning architecture, education, even demolition. And in setting up Rota, I thought it was really interesting about how the artists and architects who work there really had to undertake a lot of training in demolition and ideas of health and safety. They also needed a heck of a lot of space in the site that they've got on the outskirts of Brussels, where they could employ experimental processes for cleaning the materials and restoring them so they would actually be fit for use in the construction industry in the manner in which contractors have become accustomed to be able to receive them and use them like straight off the peg. And this idea about like providing warranties and websites to connect with new users is quite a critical link in the chain if we are to employ material reuse in architecture. But even if we do have all that in place, and at the moment, especially in the UK, we only have a precarious infrastructure at the moment, there's still the challenge of figuring out how to introduce material reuse within the procurement process. If you introduce it too late, it requires wholesale adaptation of design and coordination of the project to accommodate what it is that you want to reuse. If you add it too early, then it necessitates a lot of storage and can even mean that materials become unavailable over the course of the building's construction. So there are demands beyond the immediate considerations of how they're applied, which we as designers really need to begin to take into account. And this project, Mo de Movimiento, puts the process into practice and demonstrates how it can be much richer than just carbon savings, which can be the output of such work. So Lucas Muñoz's work in transforming a recording studio, which had previously been a theatre in Madrid, also has a social benefit, using his skills of transformation more commonly applied to product design to help create training initiatives for more traditional, small-scale local artisans, and to encourage those who face barriers to the construction job market to develop new skills. His was a strategy of improvisation and experimentation, testing, reapplication, and creative, reflective critique, which is not necessarily possible on a set timescale. Some of the strategies they've employed in the design of the restaurant space include the series of terracotta pots, as you can see hanging from the ceiling, which have been formed using a 500-year-old underground oven, which acts as an adiabatic cooling system. There's also a heating system which pumps hot water from the restaurant's 2 pizza ovens through the sculptural curves of copper piping. And there was a need to upgrade the building fabric to meet fire regulations, for which they simply sprayed flame retardant coating onto the walls, which gives it this rough texture that you can see on the column in the middle. They also reclaimed strip lights, which have been refitted with LEDs, and their redundant tubes have been removed to form chandeliers elsewhere in the scheme. Sinks have been created from copper piping and reclaimed bricks, which are fed by a grey water recycling system. And the original building fabric's been opened up to form an enclosed courtyard. And the newly exposed walls in this area needed additional structural support, requiring them to be covered in chicken wire, which had the happy effect of actually being able to train plants up them as well. So it brought more character to this area as well. And the 1.8 tons of construction rubble that were saved from the demolition work was reconstituted to form thick panels, which had been combined with blocks and reclaimed timber from the theatre's sprung floor to create seating, as you can see in the background. And the 2 people who are pictured here are Felipe Turel and Javier Antequera. And Felipe comes from a background in training for conscientious leaders as the creative philosopher of the team. His work explored the embodied energy in the supply chains of each component to be used, taking into account the supplier's energy consumption at their production plants, and even considering their working conditions there to ascertain social sustainability too. So there's great potential for impact beyond the project itself, despite the diminutive scale of actual materials that are employed in these kind of strategies. Moving on to the building scale, adapting and reusing old structures requires greater ingenuity to optimize the cultural, creative, and environmental opportunities available due to the additional complexity of working with existing buildings. The potential for degradation over time and the discovery of surprising constructions once work has begun demands additional time and expertise to be factored into the project delivery to undertake the survey and repair work early on. Sometimes the restoration efforts to retain the structure can be so extensive as to threaten to undermine the sustainability principles for which this might have been conceived in the first place, and raising the question of whether the retention has other social and cultural values instead. So this water tower, which has been transformed by Tonkin Liu and has subsequently won an RIBA National Award and the Stephen Lawrence Prize in 2021, might be seen as one such project. The 70-year-old water tank had originally been earmarked for scrap metal and sold at auction, as it wasn't deemed worthy of retention by the local planning authority. Yet the client had the foresight to realise the value of the tower as a social rather than monetary value, having served as a gathering point for many of the residents of the village who had climbed it as teenagers. It stood as a marker on the skyline to the adjacent town, and the client viewed its importance as being paralleled by other ruins of the village, a ruined Norman castle, a ruined 11th century priory, and a ruined Bailey Gate. And they commissioned Tonkin Liu to transform it into a new home. This also enabled the client to create a property with greater height than would have been potentially permitted if the building had been designed on an open site, since there's no relative detrimental effect on the surrounding skyline. So Tonkin Liu created this CLT tower, which holds the residential spaces. The cross-laminated timber stair enclosure used digital technologies to devise a kit of parts which could be slotted together and provide a bracing structure to the tower, preventing the roof from rotating against the lower level under the wind load. It's quite an ingenious interlocking stair, which when constructed provides the structural stability for the tower and acts as a spiral radiating brace against wind load. Each tread bearing on the next to help transfer the loads, which enables the walls to be reduced to a mere 80 millimeters thick. It also acts as a thermal chimney for the residential spaces. And if you see that balustrade, that's actually made of the bracing struts that were taken out of the water tank, which, although from the outside it looks like it's just singular open volume on the inside, there are a series of steel ties which crisscross internally, as you can see, which would have prohibited it being used as a social space previously. And so in stripping this out, the roof of the tank was augmented with a simple timber joist structure to form lateral support, with an opening for a skylight, which emulates that hole that was previously in the top of the water tank, as you saw in the previous photograph. And it's enabled them to create a panoramic view from the top social space of the house. The window frames serve a dual purpose here as well, because they combined with the steel truss structure fitted to the back of the steel plates, they provide a further bracing structure to the walls, which enables the removal of the internal struts. And the tank's walls have been insulated and rendered to reinstate the original colour to the outside of the tank as well. The CLT tower then creates a series of for bedrooms and bathrooms with a mezzanine above, which are accessed through fully glazed walkways from the stair tower. These bedrooms have north-facing floor-to-ceiling glazed panels which overlook the barley fields, preventing overlooking or light spillage to the neighbouring properties in the village. The project adopts an alternative approach to the circular economy, and they sourced workers from the local area via social networks generated in the local pub, which I think is a really nice touch. Like this idea of circular economy being like literal in this sense. And it afforded a sense of social sustainability for the project, but also reinstated the sense of ownership for the local community. And I think in recognition of its civic role, it's really nice that the architects actually added a clock to as a generous touch, like reinstating that civic importance that started the project in the first place. So considering strategies of reuse which confront the scale of the site and enable longer term works to be undertaken that can help the rehabilitation of the surrounding area. Site reuse asks us to engage with the opportunities that the context presents if we expand our frame beyond the footprint of the building. It requires employing strategic thinking in terms of infrastructure, funding, phasing, building rehabilitation, and regenerative development. Since many of these are programmatic rather than material strategies, they're often overlooked by a profession which is focused upon the style of a development, but they are no less architectural in practice. When I first started writing the book, Harrow Arts Centre was a transformative reference point for my research. The previous two scales of material and building reuse were more familiar, and yet here was a radical strategy which asked us to question the very fundamentals of the brief for a project and may even consider non-building strategies. Despite being approached to replace the original Arts Centre, which was inefficient and underused, DKCM realised that the reorchestration of the site would enable them to retain the buildings, which they felt had good character and environmental value. And fundamental to this was to try and move away from the necessity of decanting the entire Arts Centre into a series of porta cabins, which are ludicrously expensive and would have saved the client a lot of money, which could then be better redistributed to refurbishment of the buildings instead. So taking a broad perspective, analysing the existing programme of the site and comparing this with the requirements of the intended activities to occupy the new Arts Centre can also help overcome access issues. As Jordan Whitewood-Neal discussed in his review of the book in the AJ recently, we need to ensure that the maintenance of existing spaces does not also maintain the inequities embodied within them. So consideration of what must be maintained, what can be peeled away, and what should be restored takes a great deal of skill, care, and craft to do so. But there's also a great deal of creativity for the new insertions that enable these new activities to take place in the space, which have been developed by examining and responding to the existing structures. It's almost as if the building is a co-author of the new scheme. And there's also a consideration for how that ongoing narrative of development and change might be celebrated rather than hidden away. I think it's really exciting that the Hack Centre is an ongoing process of listening, testing, and proposing new activities to be reinserted in novel ways. And the DKC are undertaking a series of workshops with the community to co-determine new opportunities for the centre, using the site as a test bed to help develop subsequent phases which have not yet been defined because we're not entirely sure what the brief for those might be. So it's really looking at the whole scale of the site and using that as an opportunity to figure out the future for our buildings, which isn't necessarily immediately possible at the point of briefing from the client. And so the final scale looks at an even broader context, considering timescales of development that extend beyond the life of the building itself. Much like Cedric Price's shelf life of project or Archigram's fantastical plug-in cities, we need to consider beyond the immediate need for architecture's afterlife. Strategic thinking at the outset of a project can be radically transformative to the ongoing energy and social demands of a scheme. It's much more effective than retrofitting environmental systems once the design is underway. So Sands End Arts and Community Centre may be almost too familiar now from a lot of the exposure it's had for being nominated for the Sterling Prize, things like this. I think its values really been celebrated in terms of the social value that it brings to the site in facilitating a wide range of community uses with overlapping spatial needs that it's able to bring to the scheme, and the loose fit approach it adopts to the design of these spaces. But one of the things I think is really overlooked in this respect is how the building has been designed for deconstruction and low maintenance to reduce ongoing energy and material consumption. This approach demands a shift in the ways that we approach the detailing of project from the outset. And so here you can see that the CLT frame was constructed in a way which used timber to timber joints in place of glue or steel flitch plates, with dry joints and bolts which allow for future disassembly. Paying careful attention to the design of the frame early on in collaboration with the contractor meant it didn't need to be covered up because it could be really well designed from the outset and well coordinated, and removed the need for aesthetic linings such as plasterboard, which reduced the need for wet trades during consumption, but also reduced the amount of wastage from the construction of the building. And within this space, the M&E design provides a ring of surface fixtures and galvanized trunking, which can be reconfigured and plugged into, allowing a high degree of flexibility in use and easy ongoing maintenance for the users. It's a regenerative approach, which also looks at its greater context of the park as well, considering how to deal with things like surface water runoff to have a more regenerative effect on the historic walnut grove on the site, which has been able to thrive. And in the corner of that image is a historic building, which is something which isn't celebrated within a lot of the press images of Sands End Community Centre, which is Clancarty Lodge, an Edwardian parkkeeper's which as part of the scheme actually underwent a process of retrofit in recognition of what the architects realized was the quality of this existing building. So through very careful stripping back and really low intervention modifications, they were able to improve the thermal performance and insert a new timber mezzanine floor to act as a structural brace for the existing walls, which has extended the life and utility of the existing building. What is more famous, though, is the bespoke stone cycling bricks, which were created in a colour and texture to fit the conservation area context. 70% of the bricks material comes from reconstituted ceramic waste, such as discarded tiles, glass, insulation, bricks, and ceramics, which would otherwise have ended up in landfill. So this has upcycled 28 tonnes of discarded construction waste. And these also take 25% less energy to produce, surprisingly. So there's also an aspect of material reuse and building reuse that's been part of this scheme. And I think the fact that this final one that I wanted to talk about shows that you can employ each one of these scales in collaboration as well as independently, really kind of opens up the opportunities for what the architecture of creative reuse could be. So what next? Well, I think what we really need to do is to question our approach to building and to buildings, but this all needs a lot of support. In the same way that the Letty initiative was established in 2017 to support and provide guidance regarding carbon net zero principles. We need to develop similar initiatives around reuse, which span individual silos of practices or disciplines to help accelerate change. And also to engage with admin a bit more, like key performance indicators and the RG data can really help to make sure that this is seen through. So for an industry that's so careful about the contractual apportioning of risk and responsibility, it's useful to engage output from parties beyond the direct project team in order to plug gaps in knowledge which currently exist. So research collaborations and collaborative opportunities for testing and implementation with manufacturers offer new opportunities for how this could actually gain greater traction. And initiatives such as the Design Museum's Future Observatory have great potential in this respect. And one such initiative is the one that's pictured here, is in Dubbendorf in Switzerland, which is the Urban Mining and Recycling Experimental Unit. And this project confronts the challenges of designing for future deconstruction, the contribution for research, but also the dissemination and testing of reusable materials. It allows walls, servicing and fittings to be installed in a manner which can be later removed without creating waste or leaving behind residue. And therefore, we have to reconsider about how our designs might facilitate easy adaptation and conceive of materials as being a temporary borrowing for a project rather than consumption. It's quite a radically different approach to that of the traditional role of the designer, where we're usually in charge of every detail. And instead, we might have to think of ourselves as being an orchestrator of an assembly of prefabricated parts. It might sound very dry and administrative, but hopefully, as these case studies have shown, this can retain the creativity of more traditional architectural approaches. So rather than wait for governmental implementation, which we know has an enormous time lag despite the absolute urgency of these strategies to be put into place, I'm hoping that this book will inspire you to find opportunities to deploy these strategies at different scales and to make better use of their social, environmental and creative value. But we need to challenge the commissioning and briefing processes for our projects from the outset and embrace reuse as a creative act.
I do have a couple of questions based on what you've spoken about and also flicking through your book over the past couple of weeks. And I'll try and keep this maybe to like 15-20 minutes so that the talk doesn't go on super long. But my first question is about the title of the book, starting, I guess, from the beginning, and about this term creative reuse, because something I found quite interesting after reading and studying creative reuse projects is that the language around it is very changeable. Like you have the word retrofit, you have reuse, you have renovation, remodeling, updating. There are all of these different kind of words, and I wondered what your perspective was on this kind of differing language and like why the term creative reuse was used in the book.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because there is no like general consensus. There's definitely a plurality in the approaches that are being undertaken and the different sectors that are undertaking it, which I think is also in some ways like dividing our ability to be able to sort of come together and synthesize some of that understanding and the knowledge in developing like what this could be in the future. A colleague of mine at the RCA actually like has a vendetta against the word retrofit because he says it sounds like so regressive, and I think the idea about like creative reuse was saying that like it doesn't have to be backward looking. It's supposed to be something which is actually more ingenious than a blank slate. And I think the title for Building for Change actually came from the publishers, but it wasn't one that I'd considered before. But the idea that through the act of building, we are actively changing it rather than talking about changing it, and that we need to put these things into practice seems to be quite an important message to get across in the title.
Definitely. Yeah, 100% agree. I think this idea of language is something that I've been talking to quite a lot of people about as well, like not just the word for retrofit or creative reuse, but also being able to describe those kinds of projects because they often don't really fit within a specific style. Like you can't, they're not modernist, they're not deconstructive, they're not high tech. And I've often found that it's hard to kind of critique and put words to what these buildings are. And I don't know if you found that whilst you were writing text in the book as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting challenge because I think there is a particular kind of aesthetic around creative reuse, which seems to sort of try and foreground the roughness of the like existing materials or buildings or site in a kind of like almost like fetishization of a ruin in a way. But that was the only thing that really kind of united it. And I was trying to find other strategies which didn't necessarily adopt the same aesthetic. But I think you're right that like it defies isming in a way because it's not sort of imposing something on a blank site. It's really a process of like listening and surveying and understanding and reacting to what you're given. And so like trying to have like this overarching control and ideology that you're imposing on something is not really possible. And I think that's really exciting because like this hegemonic view of the architect, of this like very patriarchal, like control megalomaniac, is really outdated. And that like actually employing strategies of creative reuse, which is more humble. And I think learning from history, learning from like what you discover through opening up buildings or through reusing materials, and not necessarily knowing what your end goal is, particularly in terms of material reuse and the kind of experimentations that were going on, is, you know, in some ways it's daunting because like we like certainty, we like answers, we like timescales to be set because that's how procurement seems to want to make us work. But the open-endedness, I think, really does get back to that kind of creativity that we probably all fell in love with at some point in our education, that is much more a process of discovery and discovering things that you didn't necessarily set out to find in the first place.
I think like similar to that, do you think that creative reuse and that kind of method of working will like breed a new type of architect? Because I already see it in architects that are kind of like younger architects who are emerging at the moment, that they practice very differently to people say 50 years ago, even 20 years ago, because there's more stakeholders involved in the existing buildings, and there's a collective memory and just a need to actually talk about what you're doing rather than it being kind of all in your head. But I just wondered what you thought about that.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, the role of the architect is changing radically, like even without creative reuse being involved. But in that context, I think there are lots of different roles that we need to take on, and lots of different kind of knowledges that we need to be able to absorb in order to be able to undertake it equitably. But I think it's also interesting about like how much of a shift it is from what our expectations are of the role of the architect, and like how, you know, it promotes collaboration and thinking beyond the direct sort of architectural industry to figure out like what we can learn from other people. But one of the things that I found really exciting was when I was writing the book, I was also teaching design studio at the London School of Architecture. And one of my students, Sam Brooke, wanted to undertake a process of creative reuse in his thesis project. And I think, you know, he and I felt this kind of like strange, like icky frustration with like, I don't know what it's going to be. And like every time we tried to make it a thing, it kind of died. And we just like, and there was one moment, it was a moment of revelation. We went, oh, so it's not really about the thing, it's more about the system and the process. And so actually, are you designing an outcome, or are you designing something which is more about like strategies for reuse, and you're a systems thinker? And the moment that happened, it's like, oh no, okay, so it doesn't have to like narrow down to be like one singular output. It's like that your app design output is this iteration of this strategy, but it's the strategy that you're designing. And I think that's really exciting.
No, definitely. And I think it's something that maybe often gets misinterpreted about projects which come under the definition of creative reuse, like DVVT's project, the converted hospital. I think it has this kind of aesthetic of ruin, and I sometimes worry that that would get kind of extrapolated and then taken out of context and almost commercialized as aesthetic within itself. And I think missing that gap of like systems thinking and actually like what is the method that you're trying to promote is, I guess, maybe where the gap is. But I don't know, I saw that a lot, that in
yeah no, but I think that you've hit the nail on the head really. It's about this, the thing that I find really uncomfortable is that when you see images of things like PC Caritas and people just kind of like suck it out and like, you know, copy paste it into their projects, and you think like, well, why did DVVT end up doing that in the first place? Like, what was their approach? And the fact that actually they have that kind of like devolved responsibility where they're letting a lot of the people who are working to develop the site take on those strategies and make it their own, I think is much more interesting. But it means that you probably wouldn't end up with the same outcome. And, you know, what is it that you're learning from, but not necessarily extracting from that project in order to create a new strategy, which is going to be much more specific to who you are as an architectural practitioner, but also to the site that you're confronted with and the project and the client and the stakeholder community that you're working with as well. So yeah, I think it's an interesting quandary. But I think it's also about like this fetishization of the image and about how we think of as architecture as imagery and architecture as process.
Definitely. I think it's interesting as well being in education at the moment that there feels like there's this kind of missing link of actually how to teach that method. And you mentioned already that you were teaching that last year, but I wondered how you found teaching in that way and people's response to it too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because obviously, like, if we're going to be teaching this, we need to have like the systems of assessment set up that they can also accept that. And I think it was really wonderful to be able to discuss like with external examiners about like what their expectations are, particularly because like half of your external examiners come from practice and half come from academia, and what we recognize to be imperatives, but also things that we don't necessarily as practitioners have experience with in real life. And so learning from the students and their research and things that they've undertaken. And I mean, there are people who have been teaching this, like Duncan Baker Brown, looking at ideas of creative use and circular economy through his research and through his teaching. And there are these kind of like dispersed communities that I suppose like we might have been the outliers previously, but they're growing in number. And so hopefully there's a kind of critical mass that's coming together now that's really kind of hopefully share some more of that understanding. I think like ACAN and StuCan, the Climate Action Network, is an invaluable resource in that respect. And there is so much support and passion and enthusiasm for how we can support changing the education system in that respect, but also about how you can disseminate the findings, because there isn't really a network out there at the moment other than who are taking on that challenge. And if we don't know about it, everyone's trying to start from scratch and we're never going to get far.
Definitely. Yeah, I'm hoping in the next 5-10 years we'll see a big shift. I think it's already kind of coming, but it'll be interesting to see what the result of that is and what architects of my generation or the next generation end up doing with the skills that they collect at university.
Yeah, I mean, and that generation is going to have to lead practice, because there's so many of us who are in practice who didn't have to confront these issues, and we're learning a lot. But you know, when everyone's busy, there's only so much CPD you can do, and learning on the job is a really tough thing, especially in the kind of current climate. But it's absolutely essential. So I think there's a kind of shift in hierarchies about like how we're learning as a profession, that we really need to embrace as well.
It's similar to the next point about this idea of slowness, and that if we're to take on board creative reuse projects as an architectural profession, that the time allocation is going to need to be much greater to be able to do these things properly and to do it justice and actually update buildings in a way where you don't have to keep doing it every 10 years. And I think it's interesting to see how that shift might happen, because obviously there'll be more resource and the kind of fees that architects will be needing will be higher, but that also hopefully in turn gives more space for learning within practice if this kind of slowness comes about. But I wondered if you'd already seen that happening or if it's just something you hope for.
No, I think it is definitely happening. And I mean, the bravery that DKCM demonstrated through challenging the brief for Harrow Arts Centre really did require them to change the timescales for the project and think about like, okay, well, we're going to have to survey the buildings now in order to generate a brief, rather than generate a brief and then figure out what's going to fit. Otherwise, it's going to be a waste of time. But I think like the really ingenious thing was using other skills and other understandings, and using that kind of financial leverage, that even if someone says like, look, I know the buildings are nice, I know it's a carbon issue, but I still want to demolish them, and you can turn around and say like, but yes, I have this spreadsheet that says like you're going to save like thousands and thousands of pounds by not having to demolish them, and like, oh, okay. So like, what other leverages do we have, is an important thing to confront. But like the question of time, so like the time for a project and the time that we consider a building to be like live, is definitely like a frame scale shift that we have to embrace. And I think like all of these strategies that are thinking like beyond the life of the building, that are thinking about regeneration and deconstruction, like that's something that is a really hard ask to get a client to get on board with, because like they have an immediate need now, and they have like immediate funding, and they need immediate return. And to try and open that up and think like, well, you know, there might be a cost saving on like maintenance, but is it purely an ethical leverage that we're thinking about in terms of like trying to save waste and maintenance in the long term? You know, it's a difficult negotiation to go through for sure.
My last question, bringing us back to London, is obviously Battersea Power Station and the renovation of that. It reopened last week, I think. I think it's quite a curious example of a creative reuse project that almost amplifies everything creative reuse is against.
Yeah.
The luxury shopping centre with luxury apartments, but it retained the existing building. And I personally think that it's a symbol of greenwashing, and it's quite a complex example of creative reuse. But I wonder if you think that this kind of idea of saving an old building to almost offset something else which is happening, which is perhaps equally as damaging to the environment, is going to be born out of the movement of creative reuse.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem, I haven't been to see it myself, so that's like my first caveat. But it does seem to be almost like, yeah, like heritage washing in a way, that like, oh, we kept best power station, but it is like a husk of its former self, and like how much of it is there. I mean, it's obviously been a great restoration project for the whole like switch panels and everything, which is kind of fascinating in and of itself. But I would be really interested to know more about like the greater context of the development, as in like, is it literally just it's been reduced to a shell, and that there is a huge amount of demolition? Where did that demolition go? How far out of London did that have to go? Like, what happened to it? Is it in landfill? Like, I want to know like the full story of it. And at the moment, I feel like most of the press has been around, look what's happened to Battersea Power Station. But I would really want to know about like, how did that get there in the first place? And you know, is it, how much steel and concrete has gone into making these new spaces, where we've had spaces which probably could have been reappropriated, have greater character? I mean, there were some fantastic spaces in there, like this kind of weird space odyssey, like ceramic, like room that I remember going into once. It was like, this is amazing. And is it still there? Is it just in a really private bit? I don't know. But obviously, like the reason why they kept that building was not because they were, well, I don't know about the full intentions of it, but the primary driver seemed to be more for a heritage point of view, and that this landmark on the River Thames could, well, had a value in that it was iconic, literally, and the fact that the Tate Modern had been such an amazing reappropriation. They obviously saw that, you know, there is a way that you can reuse some of these buildings, and it will have like more of the character of like the London skyline. You know, it's like, if you're attracting especially an international market, it's the image of London. It's something that you can put in a snow globe and people would know where you've been. And so like, if you can live in it, great. But I mean, I think you're right, like how much of it really is about retaining that building, and how much of it is about creating a new building which just happens to have an old building attached to it. I'm dying to go and find out, and I'm dying to hear more from the team that are involved about like exactly how that happened, which I'm sure we'll find now. Like, someone will tell us, I'm sure.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for answering my questions, and it was great to hear all of your thoughts about the topic, because I think it's one of the most important topics that we should all be talking about, and it's getting there, but I think it's still not discussed enough. But yeah, it was great to have you as part of the Architecture Foundation Book Week.
And thanks for having me. I mean, it's wonderful that there hopefully will be more people who might be thinking about and challenging some of these issues now. So I'm really excited to see what happens as a result. Thank you.
Thank you.